There is a photograph that has been shared hundreds of thousands of times on social media, and the first thing most people do when they see it is laugh, because it looks absurd. It looks like a joke. There is a row of porta-potties, the kind you associate with outdoor concerts and construction sites, and that specific kind of desperation you feel when the line is 12 people long and you have already waited 20 minutes. Except these ones have curtains in the windows, and a welcome mat out front, and someone inside them sleeping. The scale of the problem, why this exists at all. Before you decide how you feel about porta-potty homes, you need to understand the situation that produced them. Because nothing this strange happens in a vacuum. Things this strange happen when every other option has already been tried and tried again and failed worse. According to the federal government's own count from January 2025, exactly 745,000 people were homeless on a single night in America. Nearly 150,000 of them were children. Those numbers dropped slightly from the all-time record set in 2024, but only slightly. The kind of slightly that does not feel like progress if you are one of the people being counted. California alone accounts for more than 161,000 of those people. In cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, the shelter system is so overwhelmed that even people who want to go inside cannot get a bed. Waitlists stretch for weeks, months. Some people have been on shelter waitlists so long they have given up checking. Here is a number that should stop you cold. In New York City, the average cost to build one unit of affordable housing through official city programs has crossed $500,000. In Los Angeles, the city's own auditors found that some permanent supportive housing units were costing over $800,000 each to construct. $800,000 per unit. For housing that is still years away from being ready. Meanwhile, tonight there are people sleeping on sidewalks in cities that have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on programs designed to prevent exactly that. And this is where the porta-potty enters the conversation. Not because it is a good solution. Not because anyone looked at a plastic sanitation cabinet and thought, yes, this is the dignified answer to one of the most complex social crises in modern American history, but because the gap between what the system promises and what it actually delivers has become so enormous that people are filling it with whatever they can find. A porta-potty costs between $900 and $1,300 new. It is already a weatherproof, self-contained, structurally sound plastic shell. It is designed to withstand outdoor conditions. It has a roof, it has walls, it has a door that closes. And for someone who spent the last 3 nights sleeping under a highway overpass, that door that closes is not a small thing. That is the math that produced this idea. Ugly math. But math that adds up when you are the one doing the counting in the dark. Where the idea came from. The origin story. Nobody sat down in a boardroom and decided that porta-potties were the future of affordable housing. That is not how any of this started. The way it actually started is messier and more human and, depending on how you look at it, either more hopeful or more damning than you would expect. The earliest documented experiments with converted sanitation units as emergency shelters began appearing in the late 2010s, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, where the intersection of a severe housing shortage, a growing unsheltered population, and a culture of do-it-yourself pragmatism created conditions where almost any idea was worth trying. A contractor in Portland, Oregon, a man who had spent 20 years building and remodeling homes and had watched the city's homeless population grow year after year outside the windows of whatever job site he was working on, first started thinking about sanitation units as shelter components around 2017. He was not looking to convert them wholesale. He was thinking about them as modular components, the way you might think about a shipping container or a prefabricated wall panel. Something structurally sound that you could modify rather than build from scratch. He was not alone in arriving at that idea. Around the same time, a nonprofit in the Bay Area was quietly experimenting with sanitation cabinets as privacy enclosures in tent encampments, not as full shelters, but as a middle step between a tent and a building, a way to give people a door that locked and 4 walls that did not flap in the wind at 2 a.m. Then came a moment that changed the conversation entirely. In 2019, a small nonprofit in Kansas City called Restart began working with a local fabricator to convert decommissioned portable sanitation units into single-person sleeping shelters. These were not active porta potties, just to be absolutely clear, because that is a question that needs to be answered before anyone can continue reading this comfortably. The toilet component was removed entirely. The waste tank was cleaned, sealed, and in most cases removed. What remained was the shell, a plastic enclosure roughly 4 feet wide by 4 feet deep by 7 feet tall, with a locking door, ventilation slots near the roof, and enough interior space to fit a narrow sleeping platform and a small shelf. The toilet was gone, the shell stayed. And inside that shell, with some modifications, was something that looked, however improbably, like the beginning of a room. Word spread the way it always spreads in the homeless services world, through case managers and shelter coordinators and volunteers who sit next to each other at city council meetings and share the same exhausted look. By 2021, similar experiments were happening in a half-dozen cities. By 2023, a handful of organizations had turned the concept into something replicable. Something with a design, something they could build twice. Nobody called it a success story, but they kept building them. And that, in this context, counts for something. What they actually look like, the design breakdown. Okay, let us go inside. A standard converted porta-potty shelter starts with a decommissioned unit purchased from a sanitation company. These come off the market constantly. Sanitation companies retire units after roughly 5 to 7 years of service, not because the shells are failing, but because the internal components, the tanks, the seats, the hardware, have reached the end of their maintenance cycle. The shells themselves are high-density polyethylene, which is the same class of plastic used in kayaks and industrial storage tanks. It does not rot, it does not rust, it does not warp in the rain. A decommissioned unit in good structural condition sells for between $100 and $300, depending on the region and the supplier. The first thing that comes out is the toilet, all of it, the seat, the tank, the chemical reservoir, everything. The floor is power washed, treated with an industrial sanitizing agent, and allowed to dry completely before any construction begins. This part matters. Organizations doing this work correctly are meticulous about the cleaning process, not just for hygiene, but because the psychological barrier to living in something that used to be a porta potty is already significant enough without adding any ambiguity about what condition it was left in. Once cleaned, the interior is lined with a thin, rigid foam insulation panel on all 4 walls and the ceiling. This is critical. High-density polyethylene conducts temperature efficiently, which means an uninsulated unit becomes an oven in summer and a freezer in winter. The foam panel layer, typically about 1.5 inches thick, breaks that thermal transfer enough to make the interior tolerable across seasons. Some builders add a second layer of reflective bubble insulation over the foam for additional temperature control. The floor gets a plywood platform, typically 3/4 inch, cut to fit the interior footprint. Over the plywood goes either a thin foam mat or a section of carpet remnant, both for comfort and for insulation against the cold ground below. The sleeping platform is built directly into the structure, a narrow raised surface that doubles as storage underneath. In a 4x7 interior, you are not fitting a queen bed. You are fitting a surface roughly the width of a cot. It is enough. It is the width of a surface that a human body can sleep on, which is all it needs to be. Ventilation gets cut into the upper wall sections. 2 or 3 small louvered vents, the kind used in shed construction, allow air flow without creating a direct opening to the elements. Some builders add a small solar-powered ventilation fan, a 12-volt unit that costs about $30 and runs off a single small panel mounted on the roof. The door gets a deadbolt. Always a deadbolt. If you ask the people living in these units what the single most important feature is, the answer is almost always the lock. Not the insulation, not the bed, the lock. Some units have been fitted with a small LED light strip connected to a battery charged by a solar panel no larger than a laptop. Some have a narrow shelf for personal items. Some have a small hook near the door for a jacket. A few of the more developed versions have a tiny folding table that drops down from the wall like a Murphy bed in miniature. None of this is luxury. Nobody is pretending it is luxury, but when you stand inside one of these finished units, what you notice is that it does not feel like a porta potty anymore. The smell is gone. The associations are still there, stubbornly in the back of your mind, but what you are actually standing in is a small, clean, dry, insulated room with a lock on the door and a light on the ceiling. For someone who has been sleeping outside, that is not nothing. That is almost everything. What it actually feels like to live in one. Here is where most coverage of this topic stops being honest. Writing about the design specs of a converted porta-potty shelter is one thing. Writing about what it actually feels like to crawl inside one at 11 o'clock at night when the temperature is dropping and you have nowhere else to go, that is a completely different conversation. So let us have that conversation. Starting with the thing every single person watching this is already thinking about: the smell. Properly cleaned and converted units do not smell like a porta-potty. That is the straight answer. Once the tank, the seat, and all the internal hardware are removed and the interior gets a serious industrial sanitizing treatment, the chemical smell is gone. What the finished unit smells like depends entirely on who is living in it and how recently it was cleaned, which, if you think about it, is the exact same answer you would give about any room in any apartment building anywhere in the country. That said, the first time you walk up to one of these things and your brain clocks the shape, the color, that door handle, your nose is going to stage a full revolt. It is going to be absolutely convinced it knows exactly what is happening in there. It is wrong. But you are going to need a minute, maybe two. That is not a criticism, that is just biology. Temperature is the more serious daily reality. Even with foam insulation lining the walls, a small plastic enclosure heats up fast in summer and holds cold like a storage unit in winter. Residents describe summer mornings as manageable and summer afternoons as genuinely rough, especially in places like Phoenix or the inland valleys of Southern California. Winter runs the opposite direction. The insulated interior actually traps body heat reasonably well once the door is sealed for the night. A veteran named Gerald, who spent 2 winters in a converted unit in Kansas City before moving into an apartment, put it plainly. He said the first night he was certain he would not survive until morning. By night 3, he had figured out that sealing the door gap with a rolled towel kept the inside livable. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that he had been colder in the barracks, which honestly says something about the barracks, but that is a different video. The units are not the answer, they are the starting point. That distinction matters more than almost anything else here. The communities that built them and the people who live in them. The organizations doing this work are not waiting for permission, and they are not particularly interested in being told that what they are building is unconventional. In Kansas City, the Veterans Community Project, founded in 2016 by combat veterans Brian Meyer and Mark Solomon, has been operating a tiny home village for homeless veterans that has drawn national attention. While their primary structures are purpose-built tiny homes rather than converted sanitation units, the model they pioneered, small individual structures, wraparound services, a path to permanent housing, has been directly cited by every organization working on converted shelter programs as the template they are trying to replicate. The VCP's data is striking. Veterans typically stay 14 to 16 months before transitioning to permanent housing. The organization has served over 8,000 veterans at its community center since opening. And when a veteran leaves, they take their furniture with them. Every piece of it, because the point was never just a roof. The point was a life. In Los Angeles, a man named Darnell, a 53-year-old former warehouse worker who lost his apartment during the pandemic shutdowns, spent 4 months living in a converted porta-potty shelter unit operated by a small nonprofit in the San Fernando Valley. He described the experience with a clarity that most policy papers never achieve. He said he had been in the big shelter downtown, the one with 400 beds and a curfew at 6 in the evening and a rule that said you could not bring your dog. He said he lasted 11 days. He said the converted unit was smaller than his old bathroom, but it had a lock. And his dog could sleep at the foot of the bed. He said that was not a small thing. He said that was the whole thing. In Detroit, the same city where a woman named Tasha Williams converted an abandoned school bus into a home for her children, community organizations have begun looking at converted sanitation units as a potential emergency response tool, not a permanent solution. A bridge. Something you can deploy in 72 hours on a vacant lot while the longer process of building real permanent housing continues at its bureaucratic pace. In Seattle, the Low-Income Housing Institute, which has been operating tiny house villages since 2015 across the Puget Sound region, has studied converted unit programs in other cities and is cautiously optimistic. They have seen what small individual shelters do for people who have been cycling through congregate shelter systems for years. They have the data on what a locked door does for sleep quality, for mental health, for the basic human capacity to imagine a future. They are not romantic about the limitations of a 4x7 plastic shell. But they are also not dismissive of what it represents for the person inside it. The people living in these units are not a category. They are not a demographic. They are Gerald, who served 2 tours and came home to find that the country he served had very little interest in helping him find a place to sleep. They are Denise, who lost her job and her apartment within 60 days of each other and spent 14 months on a shelter waitlist that never moved. They are a rotating cast of human beings who ended up in a situation that nobody plans for and discovered that a converted porta-potty, of all the improbable things in the world, was the closest thing to home that anyone had offered them. The government fights back. Zoning, permits, and public outrage. You knew this chapter was coming, because it always comes. The moment any unconventional shelter solution begins to gain traction in America, a particular sequence of events follows with the reliability of a bad sitcom rerun. A community organizer builds something that helps people. It gets media coverage. The coverage reaches a city council member's inbox, and somewhere between the inbox and the next scheduled meeting, the words "safety hazard" appear in a press release. Converted porta-potty shelters have run directly into this wall in city after city. In Los Angeles, the same city that famously confiscated tiny homes built by Elvis Summers for a grandmother named Smokey, who had been sleeping in the dirt for over a decade, converted unit programs have faced permit challenges that would be comical if the stakes were not so serious. A structure that can be deployed in an afternoon requires, in some Los Angeles jurisdictions, an 18-month permit process before it can be legally occupied. 18 months. The woman who needs it tonight is supposed to wait a year and a half for a committee to finish discussing the fire egress requirements of a 4x7 plastic box. In Portland, neighborhood opposition to a proposed converted shelter village in a commercial zone produced a public hearing that lasted over 4 hours. Residents raised concerns about property values, about sanitation, about what it would mean for the character of the neighborhood to have homeless people living nearby in structures that used to be porta-potties. Not one of the people raising those concerns appeared to consider what the alternative was for the people who would have lived in those units. The proposal was tabled. In Phoenix, a pilot program that placed 12 converted units on a church parking lot with the full cooperation of the congregation was shut down by the city after 6 weeks following complaints from 2 neighboring businesses. The 12 people who had been living in the units were given 72 hours to vacate. The city's official statement said the structures did not meet building code requirements for permanent habitation, which was technically true. They had also kept 12 people off the street for 6 weeks, which the official statement did not mention. The zoning problem is structural, not incidental. Building codes written in the 1980s were not designed with 4x7 converted sanitation units in mind. They were not designed with the idea that a human being might need to sleep legally inside one. Updating those codes requires political will that most city governments are not willing to spend on a solution that photographs poorly and generates neighborhood opposition. And this is the part that should make you genuinely angry. Because the same governments blocking these programs have, in many cases, spent decades failing to build enough affordable housing, enough shelter beds, enough of anything to address the crisis that made porta-potty homes seem like a reasonable idea in the first place. They created the problem, and now they are citing code violations to prevent people from solving it with $200 plastic shells and deadbolts. Do they actually work? The data here is what the numbers say, with the caveat that the data on converted porta-potty shelter programs specifically is still limited because the programs themselves are still relatively new and scattered across jurisdictions that do not always share information with each other. What we do have is the broader data on small individual shelter units as a category, which includes tiny homes, converted containers, and purpose-built micro-shelters. And that data is consistently more encouraging than the results from large congregate shelter systems. In Seattle, where the Low-Income Housing Institute has been operating tiny house villages since 2015, over 6,000 people in the King County and Pierce County areas have transitioned off the streets through tiny home village programs since 2022. Over 98% of those who moved into permanent housing were still housed 1 year later. 98%. That is not a rounding error. That is a fundamentally different outcome than most emergency shelter programs produce. Compare that to Los Angeles' Inside Safe program, which spent $300 million and, according to the city's own data, saw roughly 40% of placed individuals return to homelessness. $300 million. 40% back on the streets. The converted porta-potty programs that have been able to gather outcome data tell a consistent story. People who move from unsheltered homelessness into any form of individual enclosed shelter show significant improvements in mental health outcomes, in engagement with case management services, and in their eventual transition to permanent housing. The privacy matters, the stability matters, the locked door matters in ways that are difficult to quantify but show up clearly in the data when you look at what happens next. Cost per unit for a converted porta-potty shelter, fully modified and ready to occupy, runs between $300 and $800, depending on the extent of the modification and the cost of materials in a given region. Even at the high end of that range, you could build 100 units for $80,000, 100 people, off the street, with a locked door and a light on the ceiling for $80,000. The city of Los Angeles spent $800,000 per unit on some of its permanent supportive housing projects. Do the math or do not. The math is upsetting either way. The bigger picture, what this says about America. Step back for a second. Just step back and look at what we are actually talking about here. We are talking about a country that put a man on the moon in 1969, a country that built the interstate highway system, a country that produces more billionaires than any other nation on earth, and is home to companies whose market valuations exceed the gross domestic product of most countries. We are talking about that country. And in that country right now, today, people are converting portable toilets into bedrooms because the housing system has failed so completely that a decommissioned sanitation cabinet represents an upgrade. That is not a talking point. That is just where we are. And here's the part that is genuinely complicated. Because the people building these things and the people living in them are not symbols of failure. They are examples of something much harder to dismiss. They are examples of human beings refusing to be defeated by systems that were designed, whether intentionally or not, to make survival as difficult as possible for people without money. A woman who spent her savings on a damaged shipping container and taught herself how to wire a solar panel from YouTube videos. A man who built 37 tiny homes with his own hands after watching his neighbors sleep in the dirt. A veteran who figured out that a rolled-up towel in the door gap of a converted porta-potty made the interior warm enough to sleep in without a coat. These are not people who gave up. These are people who looked at the rubble of what the system left them and decided to build something anyway. The converted porta-potty home is the most honest object in America right now. It is uncomfortable, and it is small, and it photographs terribly, and it is the clearest possible evidence of a failure so vast and so bipartisan that nobody in power has any interest in looking at it directly. But it is also, for the person inside it, a door that locks, a dry place to sleep, a space that belongs to them. And in a country where 750,000 people do not have that, even the most improbable version of it matters. The question worth asking is not whether a converted porta-potty is a dignified solution. It is not. Nobody thinks it is. The question worth asking is why, in the wealthiest country in the history of human civilization, we have allowed the problem to get large enough that the answer to it involves a portable toilet and a deadbolt. That question does not have a comfortable answer, but it is the right question. And it is the one that the Girl Scout troop building tiny homes in Seattle and the veteran in Kansas City who figured out the rolled-up towel trick and the woman in Detroit who tiled her shower floor with broken ceramic pieces are all, in their own way, forcing us to confront. They built something with what they had because nobody else was going to. There is a welcome mat outside a converted porta-potty shelter in Los Angeles. It is the kind of welcome mat you could buy at any hardware store for $6. It has a pattern of leaves on it and the word welcome in block letters. Somebody put it there deliberately. Somebody chose it. Somebody set it down in front of a door that used to be on a portable toilet at a construction site and decided that this was a home now, and homes have welcome mats. That is either the saddest thing you have read all week or the most quietly defiant. Maybe both. Probably both. If this video made you think differently about what a home is and what it takes to lose one and what it means to build one from nothing, hit subscribe. I cover these stories every week, and click the video on screen right now. What happens there connects directly to everything you just watched.